Good afternoon, everybody. So I was going to talk a little bit about some work we've been doing on designing and identifying key performance indicators, particularly when we think about complex service networks. And as Veronica said, this is one of the regular webinars we're doing on tools and techniques that have been developed by the Alliance over the years, and going back to some of the work we've done previously, just to remind people about some of the material that, if you like, is on the stocks that might be useful. So the thinking behind this is that in many ways, if you think about the challenge for designing these, apologies, that's a user error there. Yes, so if you think about the challenge of designing these metrics in complex service networks, there are a number of specific reasons that we got involved in this work. So the first thing is, if you think about a service contract, often the contractual customer, so to the right-hand side of this slide as you look at it, the part of the organisation that defines the procurement spec is not necessarily the same as the customer that receives the service. So some of the early work we did in this area was with BAE Systems, and in BAE Systems' case, often you will get a part of the Ministry of Defence, Abbey Wood, that will define the procurement specification and say this is what the service should be, but then another part of the MOD will receive the service, so the Portsmouth Naval Base or one of the Air Force bases, Marham or wherever. So you end up with this slightly complicated situation where the contract is driven by one part of an organisation, different part receiving the service. And then the second question you then got to ask is, how do we then track whether we are both delivering the service that the contractor requires, as well as delivering the service that the recipient requires? That's further complicated in the case of some of the complex services that we've been looking at, because of course there's not just one partner involved in the delivery of this service. So in the particular case I'm going to use as an example here, different organisations that were involved in Portsmouth in the WSME contract. So WSME is a contract which basically involves maintaining or looking after the ships in Portsmouth. As part of that contract, BAE Systems was asked to also look after the entire naval base, so to manage the facilities, manage the inventory, maintain the roads and so on, provide catering and accommodation for sailors and their families. BAE Systems don't want to do all of that work themselves, so they outsource or subcontract the catering work to Aramark, a catering specialist, let's say. They partner with Babcock to provide some of the facilities services. So you end up with this really quite complex operational delivery network where you've got Babcock and BAE and Aramark working with the local naval base to try and deliver this service that somebody else has set the specification for. And of course, all of those organisations have got their own internal metrics. So Babcock is working to a certain set of KPIs, BAE is working to a slightly different set, Aramark's working to a slightly different set, and yet unless the organisations collaborate and work together, you're not going to successfully deliver the contract. So that was really the setting we were thinking about when we were doing this particular piece of work, and saying, well, how do you design key performance indicators in such a complex network setup? So we had worked on really a process for doing this, and there were a number of phases to the process. So the starting point was really thinking about just understanding the network, the complex service, what's involved, who the partners are, what they're looking for from this service. And so typically that would take a couple of weeks in terms of understanding the network itself. We then did a piece of work which was a survey, which was really trying to identify through the survey what success looked like to the different partners involved in the delivery of the service. So what was the local MOD representative or representatives, what were they looking for, what would success look like to BAE Systems, to Aramark and so on. And then we had a couple of workshops, one where we used that initial survey of what success might look like for the individual partners to build something that we call a success map, and I'll come back to what that is in a second. And then once we built the success map, we used that to identify candidate cases that might be used by all of the partners collaboratively to manage the enterprise, if you like. And if you think of the enterprise as, in this case, Babcock and Aramark and BAE and the local naval base in Portsmouth, that's the best way to think about the enterprise. Once we define the candidate KPIs, then you get into a phase of saying, well, actually, how are we going to now go and access the data we need to? How are we going to set the reporting regimes up and make this, if you like, business as usual inside this particular part of the organisation? The way that we use this process was really, I think there's a couple of ways you can think about it. So one is you might think about this as a process for thinking about what are the KPIs that you should include in contracts. So if you're negotiating with, in BAE Systems case, Abbey Wood, and Abbey Wood is thinking what KPIs should we include in the contract for risk and reward mechanisms, then having gone through the thinking process I'm about to describe and having selected the right KPIs, you can make sure that you end up with contractual KPIs that make sense to those that are receiving the service. And of course that's important, because if you end up with different contractual KPIs to the ones that really reflect the service that partners want to deliver and receive, you can end up with all sorts of mismatches. The other thing to think about is, of course, you're defining KPIs here, which then can be used to monitor the operational health and efficiency of the contract as it's delivered. So how well is this group of organisations actually working together to deliver the service that's needed? And then there are two scenarios that you can try and apply this thinking process to. So the first one is for existing contracts, and here we've done both of these scenarios. So here, when we used this particular process with WISME, we were actually using the process to reflect on whether the metrics, the KPIs that were being used in the WISME contract were the appropriate ones. And indeed, we repeated that with the Triple S contract. Triple S was about surface ship support contract. But you can also use it for prospective contracts. So if we've got a new contract coming up and you want to think about what should be the KPIs that are built into the contract, then I think the same methodology applies for understanding or thinking about what the right KPIs might be. So at the heart of the process is this concept called success mapping. And success mapping, I'll illustrate in just a second. But really what we're trying to do with success mapping is understand what success looks like for the different partners in the contract, and understand how the different drivers of success link together. So if you imagine, you've got a complex service contract with 3 or 4 different organisations involved in it, and you just sat down and said, well, what should we measure? How might we measure this? The success of this contract, you could brainstorm thousands of things that would be interesting to know. You could talk about whether it was delivered on time, the quality levels, how satisfied the people were. You could talk about safety issues. You could talk about effective utilisation of materials. You could talk about days availability of equipment and so on. I mean, just an enormous list of things that you could think about where you'd say, oh, wouldn't it be interesting to measure X? And so we use the success mapping technique to say to people, rather than start the conversation about what might we measure, let's think about the question, what does success look like? And then on the back of that, let's start to worry about which the key metrics might be. And a way to think about success map is really as this notion of a sort of cause-effect model. So it's really meant to show what are the drivers of performance in a complex service network, and how those different drivers of performance are linked together. So what's the relationships between them? So just a simple illustration, and then I'll show a slightly more complicated version. A simple illustration of what a success map does. If you think about, start at the top of this page, what I might say is I'm trying to improve customer satisfaction through a particular contract. So then you say, well, how are you doing that? And the way that I'm doing that is by improving delivery performance. And so then you say, well, how are you improving delivery performance? And the way you were doing that is improving stock control. And then you say, well, how are we improving stock control? Well, the way we're doing that is gathering ideas from staff. So you've got a sort of logic flow. You can think of the bubbles here as levers I'm trying to pull, and the arrows which show how these levers are linked together. So I think by getting ideas from staff, I can improve stock control. By improving stock control, I can improve delivery. By improving delivery, I can improve customer satisfaction. Of course, that's a really simple illustration, and in fact, in reality, the success map looks much more complex. And I'll give an illustration of this for the WSME contract in a second. So one of the things, the outputs from this process is the success map itself. It's a sort of agreed picture, a shared understanding amongst the members of the service network about what success looks like. The second thing that you then start to do is you say, well, actually, if that's what we think success looks like, then let's think about what we should measure and how we will track whether we are working together as a partnership to deliver the outcomes that we're trying to deliver. And then the third output from the process that I was mentioning earlier is really some thoughts around actually, well, how do you now use this set of KPIs to manage the enterprise, the complex service network? So let's just look at what a success map looks like. And at first sight, this might be a bit of a scary picture. Actually, there are more pages than the one here in terms of the success map. This is an extract from it. But if you think about the grey bubble at the top, that fundamentally what both the WSME and the SSS contracts were all about was producing safe, capable and available outputs. So sailors, ships, capable individuals, available to go on missions when needed, operating in a safe environment. How do you produce that safe, capable and available outputs? Well, there are three major levers that you might pull. So the first one, the set in blue on the left, is around supporting sailors with increased efficiency. So I've got to provide sailors that are safe and capable and available. I've got to do that as efficiently as possible. The second lever, the one in green, is around providing support to the base. So it's not just the people, but there's the physical infrastructure. So how do I make sure that's available? And then the third lever is around supporting the ships themselves. So as well as the people in the base, the actual vessels, how do I provide support to those? And then the orange one, the integration across support services, is really a linking theme across the blue, the green and the yellow, and saying actually are there things that we can do that might both enhance our ability to support sailors and to support the ship. So imagine use of technology and the way that technologies might be used to coordinate ships and sailors. There's all sorts of illustrations you can imagine beneath that. The bubbles in yellow and orange, there's other pages that break those down, but I'm not going to go into those. If I just take the support to sailors for a second. So you say, well, how do we support the sailors with increased efficiency? Well, one thing was about increasing awareness of how to get things done. So it's a complex operation. How do I get the message across about how we get things done? Another element that was important was the quality of life for the sailors. So I want satisfied sailors that are feeling well looked after, well trained, and so on. How do I enhance the quality of life? Well, levers there around increasing ease of access to service. So knowing how to get things done is one thing. Then it being a seamless process to get whatever it is done. I want a new unit, a house, some training. Making that as seamless as possible is important. How do I increase ease of access to services? Well, one of the things the team there were thinking about was co-location of resources, and can I create co-located or shared service resources for various things? To do that, I might need to redeploy the resources. So the bubble, the blue bubble with a #5 by it, I might need to move resources from one location to another. Another way of enhancing quality of life actually was to react to new social trends. So people were concerned about where's the coffee shop, how good the Wi-Fi access is, and so on. How do I react to new social trends? Well, maybe I need to revise my services based on user feedback. So as the demographics change and people's expectations change, maybe I should change the service. To do that, to react to feedback, I need to develop feedback mechanisms. So the bubble in blue at the bottom of the page. And clearly the redeploy resources not only applies or not only affects my ability to increase ease of access to services, but also to react to those social trends. As I to change the service I need, then I've got to change resources from one location to another. So I won't go through the whole picture here, but you can see the sort of success map. And the way we built this picture was get together a cross-functional team from the different partners involved in delivering the service, and got them to explain what success looked like for them, and got them to articulate the logic of what levers they were trying to pull. We then, because WISME was an existing contract, we then looked at the existing measures. And what's quite interesting there, when you look at the measures, so the hashes in blue, so 1 to 12, were the existing measures that were being used inside the WISME contract. So you can see there's quite a lot around the increased awareness of how to get things done, the increased ease of access to services. There's quite a lot around disposing of redundant infrastructure or redeploying resources. There's quite a lot around increased maintenance efficiency, numbers 8, 9, and 10. So these are all individual KPIs. But you can also see great big gaps where the, for example, under the traditional WISME measures or the support to base at the higher level were not really tracked at all. And so then, so just that observation itself, one of the things we saw about WISME particularly was in those days, quite a lot of focus on the easy to measure and quite operational things. And yet when you looked at the success map, some of the outcomes that people were looking for, the support to base, the integration across support services, those outcomes weren't really very actively tracked. And so those where there's a pink blob are areas where we're saying, actually, maybe we should be measuring those things. Those are candidate measures. And maybe we could afford to get rid of some of the existing measures and not measure increased maintenance efficiency in 3 different ways, or increased awareness of how to get things done in 4 ways, but choose a particular measure for focusing on that and get a better balance across our set of metrics. So then to define the some of those candidate measures, we used something called the measures design template. And so the measures design template is really there to help people think about what's the measure. So, you know, what the title of the measure is. So, support to sailors was one. And then most people, when they think about measures, they think about the title, and then they immediately leap to the formula. So, about the 5th line down, and they say, how do we measure this? Well, actually, the whole point behind the measure design template is saying before you get into thinking about the formula, you really need to think about the purpose of the measure. So what am I trying to achieve with this measure? And if my purpose for the support to sailors is to ensure that all support measures are in place to enable the workforce to perform their duties with minimum harbour hassle, I'm starting to define the sort of parameters for the measure. So because it's enabled the workforce to perform their duties. It's quite a broad measure. I'm looking at all of their duties and the workforce across the whole of the base. You also think about what it relates to. So what are the objectives that this particular measure relates to? You can think about the target. You know, how good do we want to be? So do I want to eliminate all hassle? Do I want to accept a certain level of hassle as necessary? Once you've thought about the purpose and the target particular, you can start to think about the formula. So we ended up opting here for a percentage of ships reporting the quality and provision of services is improving. So we wanted to see, this is a continuous improvement measure, we wanted to see people saying service is getting better. Think about how often it's measured, so monthly, who measures it, where the data comes from, and then who acts on it and what do they do. So it's all very well measuring something, but unless you're explicit about who's actually accountable for improving performance and making sure we hit the target and thinking about what they do, then you don't actually see any change in performance. And then you can think about the incentives and the penalties around some of these things. And so for each of the candidate measures, we were going through that same process of saying, well, what we'd like, you know, there was a theme around integration across services. So we said, actually, the measure we really want here is integration across Portsmouth partners. Why are we doing that? Because we want to build confidence in something called the Waterfront Programme Office, that they'll identify and resolve issues. And so you then get into the measure, the formula, the number of unidentified events that impact the 4th generation plan. So it's a fairly structured way of going from those bubbles, the measures design templates, a fairly structured way of going from those broad bubbles into very specific things that you could take away and measure. And similarly with estate availability, I won't talk through the detail of the individual metrics. But we've never found anything when you've gone through this process of the measures design template where you said, I'd like to measure X, when you start to ask yourself the questions of why do you want to measure it, what's the target, how are you going to measure it, how often, who's going to measure, and so on. We've never found anything that you couldn't define a decent KPI for, or a decent proxy KPI using those structured questions. So what makes this process a success? Well, I think our experience in terms of designing these KPIs across complex service networks, clearly you need a sponsor in this process. And actually, inevitably defining KPIs and targets can get political. So you need a senior person who's going to promote this, not just within their own organisation. The whole point here is that most organisations have their own KPIs. What we're trying to get is agreement across the different partners involved in the delivery of the service, because ultimately they need to collaborate. So in this particular case, in the Portsmouth cases, the senior sponsors were often in the Navy, and they were effectively encouraging the other partners to get involved in this process. Facilitation matters, so actually someone understanding how you design, how you select the KPIs, and someone in an independent role, I think, was there important. You then needed the right partner points of contact, so to make sure the right people were in the room for the discussion about the success map, what success means, and making sure you had representation across the network. And then clearly end users for the performance measurement system had to be considered, because you have to then think about how can we get the data, how can we report and track some of these things. So it's a fairly structured way of thinking about KPIs. Some of the benefits, I think, certainly from the observations in Portsmouth, actually, if you get the agreement around the KPIs, potentially you've got greater speed to contract, you've got more alignment, you're better understanding of what success actually means to all the parties, and so there's more chance that you get a culture of partnership and agreement, working together across the different organisations, which in turn leads to other benefits of follow-on contracts and deeper relationships and so on. And thinking particularly about the behaviour, so the way that the metrics define what success looks like. If you have that shared definition of success, you end up with a shared set of behaviours which are more likely to drive all of the partners towards success rather than individuals. So, as I said, that's just a quick overview of one of the tools we've got. There's lots more detail about this, and indeed lots of other tools and techniques on the Cambridge Service Alliance website. We've got, for those that are not aware, our service week coming up shortly, and particularly the conference, the one-day conference on the 11th of October about growing your service business in an age of digital disruption. So we've got speakers there from Uber coming to talk about what Uber's doing in the taxi market, effectively how they're disrupting. We've got Siemens coming to talk about Industry 4.0 and the whole digital revolution that's going on in manufacturing and how that's changing things. And we've got somebody who's currently with Goldman Sachs, former CEO of Volvo Construction Equipment, coming to talk about some of the work that they're doing around disruption, using digital technology to disrupt construction industry. So I hope we see some of you in Cambridge on the 11th of October. And if not, at other events, either the Community of Interest meeting or other events that we're organising. And I know we are working with various of you on the line as well at this very moment. So let me hand back to Veronica to just wrap up this call and talk briefly about future webinars as well.
Thank you, Andy.